Hello, how are you all doing? Yeah, so nice to see you all. I'm gonna test something. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. Okay, great. I had to test that because, I'm hosting this session. I'm speaking at a very important time of the day. Uh, so at least one of my worries is covered. You are energetic, you're here. But of course, the other worry is because we've had many speakers already. Most of there's a risk for most of the things that I've said to have already been preempted somehow. But I think that's a good thing because I'm not starting from scratch. I'm not starting from zero because we've already heard about some powerful things from early speakers in the morning, but also the parallel session with young people. We've heard from Keen, Sam, and Mia, which was absolutely brilliant. I'm also speaking from a young person perspective, so most of the things will relate. Yeah, so that's a good thing. And before I proceed, I wanted to take a moment to thank the center, the UNESCO Child and Family Research Center, University of Galway, and everyone who has worked behind the scene. Because I was reflecting with some colleagues earlier during the breaks, the importance of this moment. I was seated somewhere there and I was looking at the branding for this session, shifting power. That's the first one. And I was like, this is very risky in some parts of the world that I know. Like if you're known to not hold, just planning for something titled shifting power, you're setting yourself for some big trouble. So I'm happy to be in a space that I feel safe to be discussing issues around shifting power, and I'm going to maximize that. Yeah, it's rare opportunities. So, and also before I pose you with some more challenges, because this is what we all hear about, to like keep pushing ourselves about what we can do more. I want to take a moment to also pause and just appreciate what we've been able to do already here, because having spaces like these, conference like this about young people, but also with young people. I remember when Danielle reached out to me October last year. I wasn't even sure that I was going to come to join in person, but she shared this vision with me around the conference about young people, and she thought I could advise on some things. So that in itself is so beautiful to see how we're planning to not work for young people, but also work with them. So that's something really great. And also looking at all the commitment, the room has the diverse, it's very diverse as possible. I know there are some academic, there are some practitioner, some young people in the room. We had minister in the morning. So I think this is a fertile ground already to even push further on what is possible for young people here in Ireland, but also around the world, because we're looking at what is happening here as an example. So that's really, really good. And I think it's a collective effort of everyone here for so many years. So we deserve a round of applause for ourselves. So allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Raphael Denis. My friends call me Raf. And before any title, I come here as a young Tanzanian, a son, a brother, a friend, a young advocate, a practitioner, a student, and someone still learning what it really means to share power with young people. And I name these parts of myself not because they shape, not because they're so important, but because they shape how I see the world around me. They shape what I notice, they shape what I question, and they also shape what I carry into rooms like this. And they also shape what I keep learning. And because here we're talking about participation and power, none of us arrive in conversations like this as a neutral observer. We all arrive here with histories, with institutions, with assumptions, with forms of power we can see clearly, and forms of power we may not see. We may only notice those when someone else is brave enough to point them out. So also allow me to share about my participation journey and where it all began. So my own participation journey began when I was about 11 years old, when I was elected as a junior council leader in Tanzania. At that age, I did not have the language that I have now. I was not talking about co-production, participatory research, emancipatory research or power sharing. I think more than anything, I was just trying to follow conversations, trying to remember my points, trying to not disappear into chairs that felt far too big for me, and trying to raise my hands far as I can so that I can be seen. But that space of participation mattered a lot because just as for youth panelists that we had before, the space of participation opened doors for myself and of course for other young people as well. It taught me that children could speak in public. It taught me that young people could be present and represent other young people, and that our experiences were not too small to matter. And I remain deeply grateful for that opportunity to participate. But later, as I grow older, and especially as I began to work with young people myself, I am starting to look back with a more complicated gratitude. Because yes, the door had opened, but the room was not fully ours. We could speak, but we did not always set the agenda. We could attend, but we could not always organize ourselves. We could give our views, but we were not always involved in the full cycle of decision making, from identifying the problem to shaping the question to deciding what actions could or should follow. And that tension stayed with me because participation can change a young person's life like it has done to me, but participation can also leave power exactly where it was. So it can change lives, it can provide opportunities, it can open doors, but participation in itself can also leave power exactly where power it is. So today I want us to speak, and I want to speak from inside of that tension, the tension between having participation in place and still have the power structures unshifted. Not in an attempt to dismiss participation, of course not. I'm standing here because I'm somehow a product of participation. But this afternoon, I'm inviting all of us to explore this tension so that we can see what happens when we go beyond inviting young people to participate. What happens when young people begin to shape the questions, when they help define what counts as evidence, when they give meaning to the evidence, but also when they influence what happens next. Because those are not only questions about participation, they are questions about knowledge, they are also questions about power. And I'm quite certain that all of us in this room believe in the importance of engaging young people, importance of having young people participate, because otherwise you wouldn't stay around until this time, because we have had conversation around those topics, and you're still here. So I believe we're on the same boat around believing in young people to participate and having them involved. But for this afternoon, I would like us to push ourselves even further to ask what changes when young people are treated as co-researchers and co-producers of knowledge, and how we can get there. And as we begin this exploration of co-production, I want to be very clear. A true co-production with children and young people can be hard. So this is not a romanticized argument. I understand that co-production can be slow, it takes more resources, it asks adults to give up some control, it asks institutions to become uncomfortable. And sometimes, no matter how much we try, we may still get it wrong. But perhaps the point is not to get it perfect. Perhaps the point is to keep asking better questions, to keep reevaluating our practice, and to remain driven by a serious conviction that young people should not only be heard, but trusted with power. This reflection is important because many participation spaces are created with good intentions, but good intentions do not automatically shift power. So rather than offering a model to replicate, this afternoon I'm going to offer some reflections from my own journey, some things I've seen, some things I've learned and unlearned, and some things that I'm still unsure about. And to understand how we can co-produce and share power with young people, we have to look more closely at where power is hiding in a traditional knowledge production process. So looking at where power hides in how we conduct research at the moment, how we do our practice at the moment. Power, because power is not always loud. It is not always someone saying young people do not matter. It is often much quieter than that. It hides in the assumptions we make about children. So allow me to name 4 major assumptions that continue to limit children and young people as co-researchers and co-producers of knowledge. The first assumption is that children and young people are not competent enough. And this is where the work of Khaled is very helpful. Her work shows that one of the principal barriers to children undertaking their own research is not simply children lacking competence, rather it's doubts that adults have about children's competence. And this distinction matters because when adults say children are not ready, we have to ask ourselves, not ready according to whose standards, not ready for what role, and not ready because they lack capacity or because the process has not been built to support their capacity. So this work is so important because yes, children may not have the knowledge as adults in many areas of life, but when it comes to what it feels like to be a child, children hold knowledge and that adults cannot fully access from the outside. So the question is not whether children know everything. They do not. None of us do. The question is whether we recognize the knowledge children and young people hold and whether we create the conditions that knowledge, for that knowledge of young people to become part of our research and our practice. And I'm not saying adults should disappear. You'll be angry if I say that. For a true co-production to happen. So you don't need to disappear. I'm saying adults have to take a different role from controlling the process to creating conditions where young people can contribute safely and meaningfully. So the second assumption is that listening to young people is enough. And this is where the work of Professor Lundi, who I've always inspired, she has always inspired me, and I'm so privileged to be sharing the stage with her today. So she's done, we're all familiar about her work about conceptualizing UNCRC Article 12. So her work reminds us that the right to express views and have those views given due weight applies in the context of knowledge production itself. That means children's participation is not only about being asked questions, it's also about participating in how research is being conducted, how it's shaped. So children and young people should have a say in how methods are being chosen, how findings are being interpreted, how knowledge is shared, and how decisions are influenced. I have observed throughout my practice that it is so easy for us as adults and institutions to be comfortable with voice. We know how to invite young people to speak. We know how to run consultations. We know how to collect views. We know how to include a powerful quote in a report. But voice alone is not the same as influence, because if young people are only invited to speak into structures they cannot change, then participation may be present, but power structures are not being shifted. The third assumption is that youth-led work is automatically fair. So this is another work and another reminder that tells us that recognizing children and young people as co-producers of knowledge does not mean romanticizing the youth knowledge overall. Yes, young people's knowledge is valuable. It is necessary. It can reveal some insights or some things that we might miss as adults, but it is not automatically pure. It's not equal. It's not free from power. Children and young people also live within social relations. So issues like age, gender, class, disability, confidence, language, school status, popularity, all of this matter. So these power dynamics come at play when we engage or we invite young people to participate. And if you're not attentive enough to those dynamics when engaging with young people, we risk to reproduce the inequalities we are trying to challenge. So co-production requires us to move beyond saying young people participated and questioning which young people, on whose terms, with what support, who was missing, who was quiet, who felt safe to disagree, whose knowledge was treated as evidence, and whose knowledge remained outside of the room. So if you want to co-produce knowledge with young people, yes, we may have to pay attention between power dynamics between adults and young people, but we also have to pay attention at power dynamics among young people themselves. The fourth and last assumption for today is that co-production can just happen without being resourced, without intentionality. And this is one of the most common barriers. When we say young people are welcome to co-produce, do we also put resources or institutional space that is needed to make that possible? So there's a review on youth co-production in the third sector, which is very useful here. It shows that poorly implemented co-production can become tokenistic. It can deepen existing inequalities. And this warning is very important because if co-production is under-resourced, it often becomes available only to the young people who can afford to take part. So the confident ones, the connected ones, the available ones, the ones who can travel, who can volunteer, or the ones who can speak the language of institutions. So all these assumptions are not small misunderstandings. They are mechanisms. They shape who is kept close enough to be visible, but far enough away to disturb the power structures. Moving beyond participation requires us to challenge these assumptions through our research methods, through budgets, timelines, ethic processes, authorship practices, and accountability structures. These assumptions, good news, is that they're not fixed. They can be challenged, they can be interrupted, and when the right conditions are created, young people do not only participate in knowledge production, they change what kind of knowledge becomes possible. Well, I'm sure by now you're asking about these conditions. What are those conditions? So that's what I'm going to be sharing next. So to share with you some conditions for a true co-production with young people, allow me to return or to turn to some of the work that I've conducted with young people in Tanzania, with Citizens for Change. And something to note is that I'm not offering this as a perfect model. I offer it as an example of what becomes possible and what becomes difficult when young people are not only invited to participate, but are supported to move through a process of shared inquiry, shared learning, shared action, and shared reflection. So this work was around creating a movement of a child, creating a child-led movement for safe and inclusive schools in Tanzania. And we worked with 15 schools across 8 regions in Tanzania. And primarily we worked through the child protection clubs in those schools. The work was underpinned by 2 frameworks. So theory, process of social change, it has 5 stages, and I'm gonna go deeper into those in a minute, but also youth participatory action research, which is exactly what the name suggests. So getting young people to be co-researchers and create knowledge that act to change the world. So we're gonna be speaking about this work that we've conducted with young people in Tanzania. So we did not begin by asking students to implement activities. We began by asking them to help us understand the system. That distinction matters because if young people only enter a room when it's time to act, then adults have already done the most powerful parts, defining the problem, deciding what matters, and shaping the direction of the change. So the first stage in this work was about naming the unwritten rules in the school life that students were part of. So unwritten rules around who can question an adult, who must stay quiet, which jokes are treated as harmless, which forms of humiliation are normalized, whether boys are allowed to name fear, whether girls are expected to tolerate certain behaviors, whether students can speak honestly about being punished later. And these rules are not written anywhere, but students know them because they live inside them. So we invited students in each of those schools that we worked with to name those rules and then to create a common vision together for a safer and more inclusive school they wanted. So the lesson here is young people can reveal parts of an institution that adults may not see or may have become too used to seeing. Co-production begins when young people are trusted not only to answer questions, but also to help define what the real problems are. The second stage was about building shared knowledge. Together with students, we co-developed a protective behaviors toolkit, which is a 9-week child-led session guide on how students can keep themselves and their peers safe. It used photos, quizzes, reflective stories, and interactive stories. activities. But the important thing is this: it was not designed only as a manual for adults to deliver to children. It was designed as a guide that students could use with other students. A few students in each of those schools were trained as facilitators, and they returned to the schools to lead the sessions in the child protection clubs. So students were not only learning about safety, so you can see here they were helping to create a learning space, to create learning spaces with their peers. They were asking questions, they were facilitating discussions, they were using stories and images. So helping other students to think about, they're also helping students to think about early warning signs, support networks, boundaries, protective behaviors, and how they could look out for each other. So the lesson here was that young people should not only receive knowledge, they can help produce it, translate it, adapt it, and share it in ways that make sense to other young people. The third stage was about inquiry before action. Before students designed projects, they investigated their own school environment. So we used 3D mapping to explore where students felt unsafe, included, excluded, visible, invisible. And this mattered because not every child expresses knowledge best through formal discussions. Some things emerged when students build, when they point, when they move objects around, and when they show you the place they avoid, the place they gather, the place they feel watched, or the place where nobody notices them. So the 3D mapping, in this case, for example, became evidence. It helped students and adults to see the school not only as a physical space, but as a social and emotional landscape. Students then carried out stakeholders analysis. They asked who shaped safety in the school, so whether it's teachers, students, school leaders, parents, support staff, and community members. So we worked with them to develop the interview guide, practice the interview session, let a student practice in a small group how they will conduct that interview, and let the group provide feedback to the young person rehearsing the interview, and then go back to the school environment to conduct that interview, and then come back with the answers from the questionnaires that they created to like make sense of the responses together. So collective sense making. So they listened to different perspectives, they came together for collective sense making, and this was very important because in many participatory processes, young people provide data and adults do the analysis. Here, students were part of interpreting what they have heard. They asked what patterns are emerging, who has the influence, who needs to be involved, what can students act on themselves, and where do they need adult allies, what is realistic now, and what may require a longer struggle. The lesson here is that youth-led action needs youth-led inquiry first. If young people are expected to design solutions, they also need space to investigate the problem and interpret that in their own way. The fourth stage was moving from inquiry to action. Students designed projects based on what they had mapped, heard, or analyzed. Some focus on sports and games to improve relationships between students and teachers. And that might sound simple, but it challenged the unwritten rule that teachers and students only meet through discipline, instruction, correction, and performance. Through games, students and teachers could meet differently. Sometimes culture begins to change through relationship before it changes through policy. So other groups of students focus on unwritten rules around body shaming. They challenged the idea that humiliation is just a joke, or that if someone laughs, it cannot be harm. They used posters, dramas, and conversations to make something normalized to become discussable. So this is quite an important one because it wouldn't ever be something that if we took control as adults, we would have never thought like it's something of interest or somewhere to put resources on to address. But because children and young people were involved themselves to like identify the problems, discuss among themselves what is most necessary to invest their time and effort in, look at their toolkits of talents and see what they feel called to react to. So that's where we've seen diverse ideas and student-led projects that were implemented. So it showed us something important about young people, about how young people understand safety. Safety is not only absence of harm, it's also the presence of a relationship. Sometimes, so safety is not only the absence of harm, it's also the presence of relationship. Someone who notices, someone who checks in, someone who helps you find a way. So other projects, although this was entirely a safeguarding project, ended up working on environment, talents, peer relationships, and issues that students themselves prioritized. The lesson here is that when young people shape the agenda, they prioritize the change. They do not only fill in adults' categories, they can reveal concerns and possibilities that adults may not have placed at the center. The fifth stage was documentation and learning. Instead of expecting students to produce long written reports, they were trained in participatory photography. They were given some cameras, which was not only for visibility, but it was also about them documenting and telling a story of what changes they're observing in their communities. So students' photography, the drama performances, the poster campaigns, teacher and student playing together can sometimes capture something that formal reporting language struggle to hold. And in addition to that, we also hosted learning conversations. Our team was traveling to each of the schools to just have a conversation with the student groups that were implementing the project. The lessons here was that monitoring should not only extract proof from young people, it should create a space for us to learn with them as their work unfolds. It's also about having a honest discussion with them about what is possible, what required more time, about possibilities for flexible funding. Yeah, so, and also I want to highlight that this is not all glamorous. It came with its challenges as well. So for example, one school had to drop off. We initially had planned to work with 16 schools. One school had to drop off because they could not commit the time needed to have this sort of meaningful engagement. For each of the schools that we engaged with, yet it took like 13-month journey for each of the school. So of course, what is tradition is to have once-off event where you just speak with all students in assembly. But yeah, so one of the conditions that we had in place is that 15 schools were able to commit the time that was needed. And when that condition was not there, one of the schools had to drop off. So co-production does not survive only because young people are very engaged. It survives because institutions create conditions for young people leadership to be sustained. So yeah, so moving on, I want to also share with you that this kind of work is not only possible in schools. If we start looking at participation through the questions of where power sits, if we start to investigate where power is hidden, we begin to see small but important possibilities. In many spaces, so one version of this possibility, I experienced this myself a few weeks ago in London when I was interviewing for a role with a local council. So young people were part of the interview panel. While I cannot share with you the outcome of the interview, but I can tell you what really stood with me is that how young people were not only asked afterwards what they thought. They were in the room, they asked questions, they observed, they assessed, they contributed to the discussions, and that really showed that they are having a say on what matters in their lives. Because it also says that young people's knowledge is relevant not only when we're designing youth activities, but also when we're deciding who is trusted to enter into their lives. I've also seen this version of this work with the EU Youth Sounding Board. It's not a perfect space, but it's an important one because young people are brought closer to policy conversations, not when a final decision has been made, but they also have a chance to inform guidance notes, for example, or funding infrastructures. So these examples are possible in different contexts. But what could also be useful is to share with you 4 power tests This is a set of questions that I used to reflect on when I'm looking at a youth participation activity, or if this will tell me if co-production or power shifting is really happening in the way that we engage with young people. So the first question is, did the question move? Because if the problem or the question was already defined, the proposal was already written, the indicators were already fixed, and theory of change was already approved before young people arrive, then young people may still contribute, but only inside the framework that adults have already built. So before we call something co-production, we need to ask, could young people shape what we are trying to understand in the first place? And the second test is, did adults' roles move? Because co-production does not mean adults disappear. Adults still hold responsibility, for example, for safeguarding clarity, for providing clarity, for support, for providing honest feedback. But we still need to ask ourselves, are we only preparing young people to participate, or are we also preparing adults to share power? So adults also need to move in terms of their roles. The third question is, did interpretation move? And this one really matters for those who are doing research, because data in itself is not knowledge. A quote, for example, is not yet finding. So we have to ask, could young person who we're engaging with challenge the analysis? Could they say, this is not what we meant, you're missing some context, that recommendation will not work. So if we're not able to do that, then we're not co-producing knowledge. The fourth question is resources, and this is an elephant in the room. Yeah, so many practitioners, including ourselves here, are not avoiding co-production because they do not believe in it. They're trying to do it inside the system that make it very difficult. There are short timelines, fixed outputs, preset indicators, limited staff time, budgets that fund consultation, but not the slower work of co-production. Reporting systems that want certainty before young people have even entered the process. And this matters because if the problem, budget, timeline, outcomes are already fixed before young people arrive, then we may have to ask honestly, what exactly are they co-producing? So this is a challenge not only for us practitioners, but also for funders, institutions, and decision makers. We cannot ask young people to share power inside a system that punish flexibility. We cannot ask for youth-led work while we are finding for adult-controlled timelines. We cannot celebrate co-production while we are only paying for consultations. We cannot expect deep participation at the price of one-day workshop, because meaningful co-production often costs more. It requires time to build trust, time to prepare, time to return, time to analyze together, time to adapt, time to explain what changed and what did not. So resources needs to be put there. So to close, I want to be clear that participation opened a door in my life, and I will always honor that. But moving beyond participation asks us to look at what happens after the doors have opened. Who shapes the question? Who holds the process? Who interprets the meaning? Who controls the resources? That is where power lives. That is where power has to move. This work is also intergenerational. Adults are still needed as allies, as mentors, as people with responsibility, institutional memory, resources, and duty of care. Young people are also needed as knowledge holders, as analysts, as co-authors, as people who understand realities that cannot be fully known from a distance. The task is not for one generation to replace the other. The task is to bring our different forms of knowledge closer together with honesty, with humility, and with shared influence. Because young people are already asking the important questions. They're already naming the unwritten rules. They're already imagining a safer and more inclusive future. They're already producing knowledge. Our responsibility is to build systems that are serious enough to recognize that knowledge, resource it, and allow it to shape what happens next. So I hope we leave this conference with more than a good language. I hope we leave this with a sense of responsibility to build processes that actually allow young people to move things, because the future of youth participation will not be decided by how beautiful we speak about young people, but it's decided by what we are willing to let young people move. Thank you so much.